Chapter 9, from 1803 to 1824. Section 7. The Britannia, a vessel the property of Messrs. Enderby and Sons, first discovered the whale fishery. On doubling the southwest cape of Van Diemen's Land, the crew saw sperm whales. In their progress to Port Jackson, they fell in with prodigious shoals, as far as could be seen from the masthead. On arriving at Port Jackson, the captain secretly informed the governor, who facilitated his preparation for a cruise. The sailors, however, did not conceal their observation, and two other vessels, the Mary Ann and Matilda, sailed one day before the Britannia and the Salamander on the 1st November 1791. On their departure, they encountered bad weather, but saw whales in great plenty. The attempt was, for the moment, unsuccessful. Great expectations were formed by the colonists, who anticipated that this port would be a rendezvous of fishermen. This fishery, pursued since with so much vigor, was of little immediate value to Van Diemen's Land. The duties payable on exports from the colonies were both excessive and unequal, especially in oil, the difference amounting to almost absolute prohibition, being 20 times greater than by London ships. The settlers could only procure for their own consumption or the Indian market. The whalers often carried on their operations in sight of the towns, and heaps of bone at that period lay on the eastern shore. Of the first whale taken in the Derwent, Jorgen Jorgensen declared himself the captor. The trading pursuits of the inhabitants were fettered by the privilege of the East India Company. The Act of Parliament authorizing its charter prohibited the employment of vessels less than 350 tons between England and New South Wales. The small coasting trade was, therefore, solely eligible to the people of these colonies, except in vessels unsuitable to the extent of their commerce. Thus, even the Mauritius was closed against the corn and meat of this country. This law was repealed in 1819, and thus vessels of any tonnage could be employed in the colonial trade. In the islands of the Straits, sealing was pursued with such vigor that it was comparatively exhausted at an early date. Small vessels were employed in the dangerous navigation and not unfrequently lost. Few instances of nautical disaster and personal misfortune have surpassed the case of Captain Howard in 1819. He was robbed of an iron chest containing money and jewels to a large amount. Next, the Lachlan, his property, was stolen by convicts. He freighted the Daphne for India and sailed with two women and a boy beside the crew. They anchored at Kent's Group, and Howard landed. The brig, some hours after, was observed to drift. The wind blowing hard on the shore, her destruction was inevitable. The long boat was laden, and leaving behind the passengers and some seamen, Howard, after great efforts, reached the Derwent. Under his direction, the Governor Sorel sloop was dispatched to receive the people left on the island. Meanwhile, the John Palmer entered the group, took off the women and the boy, and a bag of $400 left in their charge, and was lost with the whole of her cargo. Nor was the Governor Sorel more fortunate. The seamen of the Daphne, who left the island in a boat, saw on the northeast coast of Cape Barren the binnacle and other fragments of that vessel in which Howard perished. The same fate seemed to attend his property after his death. He had freighted the Frederick and the Wellington with sheep and cattle for the Isle of France, a market which then offered large gains. After some delay, they reached the Northumberland Islands, off which the stock all died, from want of room and the influence of climate. Unwilling to proceed without cargo, the captain detained the vessels for spars. Here the Frederick was wrecked, and 22 of the crew were drowned, but the chief officer, one woman and a boy, reached the Wellington. They then proceeded to Timor, constrained on the passage to subsist on the preserved hides of the cattle. From Timor they proceeded to Batavia. The captain died, and the crew dispersed, and the vessel was taken under charge by the Orphan Chamber, her register being lost and her owners unknown. A calamity still more singular may be worth record. The Surrey, Captain Rain, left the Derwent in 1820. Having heard that men were detained at Ducie's Island, he went there in search of them. The men came to the beach but could scarcely articulate from exhaustion. They had belonged to the Essex, a whaler. One day, a whale of the largest class struck the vessel and broke off part of her false keel. She then went ahead of them a quarter of a mile, and turning back met the vessel with such tremendous velocity that she was driven back at the rate of several knots. The sea rushed in at the cabin windows, every man on deck was knocked down, and the bows were completely stove in. The sailors were obliged to abandon the vessel, and after visiting several islands were found by the Surrey as described. The strong inclination to trade, common to emigrants, was in these colonies a passion, while the settlers were of the lower class. The want of coin induced the government to pay the debts it incurred in rum, which commonly valued at £1 per bottle, passed from hand to hand. The commissariat receipts were, however, the chief medium of exchange. They were acknowledgments of the delivery of goods for the use of the crown. They were paid by the settlers to the merchants, who on the appointed days presented them for consolidation, and received in return bills on the lords of the treasury. Every trader issued his notes. The islands of Scotland possessed a small paper currency, and to that origin were we probably indebted for our own. Dr. Johnson found such trifling bills in circulation during his celebrated tour. In Hobart Town, they were issued in great profusion. Often of the lowest value, both in amount and in credit, they kept afloat by the risk which their refusal involved. When presented in small quantities, they were usually paid. A trader rejecting his neighbour's bills would be harassed by his revenge. This was, however, done in some instances. A large issuer of notes in Launceston was staggered by a sudden demand for payment. To maintain his credit, he borrowed dollars and gave additional notes as security. A few days after they returned, and the same dollars were again borrowed by the unfortunate financier. The run was devised by his clerk, who managed by such manoeuvres to obtain a large bonus for negotiating a loan of coin. The credit of these notes depended greatly on the naval officer, a sort of collector. If admitted in payment of duties, they were current everywhere. The criminal courts continually exhibited frauds consequent on these small issues. The issuers, however, had many chances in their favour. They did not always know their own notes, but great numbers were destroyed by persons intoxicated, or lost, or worn out. The meaning of payment in currency they interpreted as giving one note for another, or 4 shillings for 5 shillings. The colonial dollars were mutilated to prevent their exportation. In 1810, dollars were imported from Bengal. To make a smaller coin, the centre was struck out and valued at 1 shilling 3 pence, the ring retaining its full current value. The Crown paid the dollar as 5 shillings and received it as 4 shillings, thus gaining 20%. In exchange for bills, and in the settlement of accounts, an injustice so shameful was the subject of parliamentary reprobation and ultimately suppressed. In 1824, the Samarang imported £100,000 of British silver, and the Lords of the Treasury directed that British coin should be paid to the troops and taken in exchange for treasury bills. The establishment of the Van Diemen's Land Bank in 1823 was the most effectual remedy of many financial difficulties. The traders obtained a charter from Sir Thomas Brisbane. The capital was divided into shares of $200, and its direction was committed to a local board. The issues of individuals were finally suppressed by Act of Council. The detection of many frauds enabled the dishonest, with a show of right, to dispute payment. They were sometimes recovered in the Court of Request. Justice was once secured by Mr. Hone in the following manner. The defendant was requested to select the notes he admitted to be genuine, and then to hand both parcels to the bench. These being marked were dropped purposely, and the defendant unsuccessfully attempting the same division once more showed that his repudiation was fraudulent and lost the cause. It was the custom to load a cart with goods and send it through the country. The peddling merchant exchanged his commodities, being a cask of rum, a basket of tobacco, a chest of tea, a bale of slop clothing for sheep and cattle. The profits were often enormous. On his return to headquarters, he would appear with a flock worth 5 times the original cost of his merchandise. The manners of a people are seen in the courts. A series of trials, arising from the same transaction, included a considerable portion of the settlers, and illustrated the trading habits which prevailed. Mr. Gunning being indebted to Mr. Lone, a merchant, agreed to pay him in cattle. This arrangement was superseded. Fearing, notwithstanding, that his claim would be damaged by a general insolvency, Lone took with him 7 men and swept from Gunning's premises a herd of various ownership. For this he was called in question by the police as a felon. In retaliation, he instituted actions for malicious prosecution. Crossley, an emancipist lawyer, issued summonses and instructed the officer to arrest, contrary to standing orders, but Timms, the provost marshal, to exhibit a spectacle, captured the police magistrate proceeding to Government House. The whole settlement was involved in actions arising out of the debt, rescue and criminal charge, either as parties or witnesses. The provost marshal was dismissed for drunken ignorance. These trials occurred in 1821 during the circuit of the judge, Baron Field, who was induced by the representations of Commissioner Bigg to hold a session in this colony. End of Chapter 9 being Chapter 2, from 1803 to 1824, Section 7.